the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, ICCNC. The central theme of both 2022 and 2023 debate cycle is belief and unbelief in a post-secular era. This session topic, typically put in a question format, is the hiddenness of God is an evidence against God's existence? And if you are not very clear about the question, but you are interested, I invite you to listen to the first section of both opening statement of Aaron and Ebrahim. To this question, i.e., is the hiddenness of God an evidence against God's existence? To this question, Aaron Rizzieri provides a positive answer. Yes, the hiddenness of God is an evidence against God's existence, and Ebrahim Azadegan provides a negative response. No, the hiddenness of God is not an evidence against God. So before introducing the debaters, let me say two things. First, there will be a short question and answer part at the end of the debate. If you have any question, please write them down in the Zoom chat box and send them to my colleagues, not to me, as I'm busy moderating. Please keep your questions short, to the point, and clear, and specify to whom your question is addressed, if not both. Second, you can use English automatic subtitles by clicking on the live transcript button just down there. Okay, now let me introduce both debaters. Dr. Aaron Rizzieri is a professor of philosophy at Coconino Community College, Flagstaff, Arizona. He has a PhD in philosophy from Arizona State University, an MA in philosophy of religion and ethics from Biola University, LA Mirada, CA, and a BA philosophy, SUNY Buffalo. His areas of specializations are epistemology, bioethics, and philosophy of religion. And Dr. Ebrahim Azadegan is chair of the Department of Philosophy of Science at Sharif University of Technology, Tehran, Iran. He has a PhD in analytic philosophy from the Institute for Research in Fundamental Sciences, Tehran, Iran, and MSc in nuclear physics from Amir Kabir University of Technology, Tehran, Iran, and a BS in electrical engineering from the Sharif University of Technology. His areas of interest are philosophy of religion, science, and philosophy of religion. Okay, so let's see, and already debaters agreed that Aaron is gonna begin the discussion. So Aaron, let's see how you're gonna argue for your positive answer to the interesting question: is the hiddenness of God evidence against God's existence? Thank you, Aaron. The floor is.
Thank you. Everybody hear me? Just one last check. Okay, that's good. All right. So let me just. All right, here we go. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Rizzieri. I'm a philosophy instructor in Arizona in the United States. I would like to thank the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California for hosting this debate, Dr. Mirdamadi for moderating, and Dr. Azadegan for participating. And I apologize if I botch those pronunciations to any degree. I'm going to offer two main lines of reasoning for why a morally perfect God, such as the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, would not remain hidden. But before I do, I want to give some background information on the general problem of divine hiddenness and define some key terms. Okay, so in 1993, J.L. Schellenberg published a book entitled Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason, in which he argued that a loving God would not create a world that contained any what he called non-resistant non-believers. A non-resistant non-believer is one who does not believe God exists, even though they do not have an aversion to knowing God. Schellenberg argues that God would provide all non-resistant persons sufficient evidence to believe he exists in order to make a relationship between the creator and that human being possible. His basic point was that God would want human beings to experience the greatest and most important relationship that they were created for, and hence it is very surprising indeed that so many people do not believe that God exists. According to the Pew Research Center, roughly 55% of the world's population is either Christian or Islamic, about 1% is Jewish, and that leaves a full 44% of the world's population outside the Abrahamic traditions. The vast majority of those persons are actually not monotheists. I will now present two arguments in greater detail for why a morally perfect God would have compelling moral reasons to not remain hidden. All right, so Schellenberg focuses on the loving nature of God. I'm going to focus on God's moral perfection. All right, so let's call our first argument heaven, hell, and hiddenness. Most theists are not generic monotheists. They're mostly Jewish, Christian, or Islamic. Christians and Muslims often believe that a failure to worship, obey, and know God can lead to negative afterlife results. A worst case scenario is that one may end up in hell. All right, so if this were the case, then God would be both cruel and negligent in failing to disclose God's existence and whatever conditions are necessary for attaining a less disastrous result. So let's focus on this notion of negligence and consider an analogy. Here's a scenario. I'll call it derelict doctor. So let's say your primary care physician has ordered blood tests for you that have detected an elevated platelet count. You must decide what further tests to pursue on the basis of your physician's interpretation of the results, but your doctor has failed to convey to you that cancer is a prime candidate. She merely indicates that cancer is possible. Any doctor who had omitted this information would be morally negligent, as this information would have increased your ability to actively seek out relevant treatments in a timely manner. Similarly, what if when we die, we all face an afterlife judgment, which could result in our eternal banishment from God's presence and the attendant pain of living forever apart from God? If that is the case, then the parallel between the derelict doctor and the hidden God is a strong one. Both would be endangering someone unnecessarily by withholding information. Many people would live very differently and try very hard to put themselves in a right relationship with God in order to avoid this fate if they knew what is at stake. Let's consider a common counter argument. Centuries ago, the Christian intellectual Blaise Pascal suggested that God remains hidden from us so that we can retain the freedom to either pursue a relationship with God or keep our distance from God. The first thing to note in relation to this suggestion is that many people who believe or even think they know God exists have significant freedom to obey what they think God's will is or not do so. The belief that God exists and has a certain moral will is what supplies them with the freedom to make this choice. Complete lack of belief in God's existence undermines a human being's ability to freely choose to know and love God or not. The second thing that can be said in response to Pascal's suggestion is that none of us value the freedom to make horrendous choices that could lead to our doom under conditions of ignorance. We would never not want to know that a specific food is poisoned in order to retain the freedom to choose to eat it. Similarly, none of us would want the doctor from the prior scenario to be our doctor. We would not value the increased freedom to make potentially harmful choices in a state of ignorance, because that's not a good situation to be in. Hence, the idea that God is preserving our free will by remaining hidden is not something a morally perfect being would do if a bad afterlife awaits those who make the wrong choices. Okay, so that's the first argument. Let us now move on to a second argument from divine hiddenness that involves people who do evil in God's name while God remains silent. In order to set up this argument, I want us to picture a world in which God's remaining silent does not lead people to do evil in God's name. Picture a world that is very similar to our own, and that people in that world also have a strong innate inclination to believe in divine beings. Yet the humans of that world are unlike us in a couple of important respects. First, they rarely claim to speak for God. The idea of knowing the mind and will of God strikes the residents of that world as presumptuous. Having dogmatic religious beliefs and projecting one's own desires onto the divine will, a rare phenomenon. Furthermore, imagine that the people in this similar world do not have religious experiences in which pernicious moral impulses and convictions feel like they are divinely approved. In a world inhabited by such creatures, God remains hidden without creating a theological power vacuum ripe to be filled by any person of power or charisma who claims to speak for God. The contrast with the actual world is clear. Here, such a power vacuum does exist. Here's an example. Frederick Douglass was a 19th century escaped slave in the United States. In his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, Douglass narrated the commission of gross atrocities against him and those whom he was enslaved alongside, and the effective use of theological convictions to rationalize the atrocities committed. So here's a quote. In August of 1832, my slave master attended a Methodist camp meeting held in Bayside and experienced religion. I indulged a faint hope that his conversion would lead him to emancipate his slaves, and if he did not do this, it would make him more kind and humane. I was disappointed in both these respects. If it had any effect on his character, it made him more cruel and hateful in all his ways, for I believe him to have been a much worse man after his conversion than before. After his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slaveholding cruelty. He made the greatest pretensions to piety. His house was the house of prayer. He prayed morning, noon, and night. He very soon distinguished himself among his brethren and was soon made a class leader and exhorter. His activity in revivals was great, and he proved himself as an instrument in the hands of the church. We can extract a strong argument from divine hiddenness from Douglass's commentary. Schellenberg has argued that a good reason to think God would not remain hidden is that communion with God would be a profound source of motivation for cultivating a sound moral category. This is a strong argument, but Douglass goes further. Douglass's depiction of the malignant support relationships that held between slaveholding and Christianity in the southern United States illustrates that when God is absent, and yet the religious impulse to justify one's actions by convincing oneself and others they are divinely sanctioned remains, this will all too often result in toxic self and group level deception that ingrains already evil practices. This makes it harder for individuals and indeed entire cultures to come to understand they are doing evil. And here's a relevant moral principle. I call it imposter. If a being knows others are systematically operating under a claim to their authority and that in ways that reinforce their morally evil ways, and that person could easily dispel such a claim, then they ought to. Imposter is highly plausible. So just imagine you work for a Secret Service organization. You have an encrypted passcode that enables you to access other agents. Imagine also that passcode has been hijacked. So an evil person is now sending out orders in your name, and let's just stipulate you're in a good position to put an end to it. But you don't. You just decide to let it go. So other people, they're not only doing evil, they think
time is up.
Yeah, that's good. They're doing evil and they're a legit authority, and that's the gist of the argument. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Actually, Aaron made two interesting arguments to the effect that if omnipresent, omnibenevolent God would exist, then God would show himself or herself to those who are interested in knowing whether God exists. And since we have some truth seekers who end up not believing in God, and they are truth seeker, they are not resistance to the divine truth, therefore God, omnibenevolent God, or omnipresent God, or put it simply, the God of classical theism, the God of monotheism, does not exist. And he provided actually two arguments. One is that if truth seekers who end up not believing in God is supposed to be in hell, then God would be negligent, and negligent God would not be omnibenevolent. And the second argument also was that under God's name, a lot of atrocities have occurred, and like, for example, religious fundamentalism, and a caring God would not allow such atrocities to be happen under God's name. So now let's see how Dr. Ebrahim Azadegan would provide a negative answer in his 10 minutes opening statement to the question, is the hiddenness of God evidence against the existence of God? Ebrahim, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And I should express my thanks before engaging my answer to this important question, that is the hiddenness of God evidence against God's existence or not. I should express my thanks to the Islamic Culture Center of Northern California for hosting this debate, to Professor Rizzieri for his contributing statement, and to Dr. Yaser Mirdamadi for his moderation and introduction, and to the worldwide audiences for participation. First, without referring to Dr. Rizzieri's argument, I express my thoughts about this argument. The problem of divine hiddenness. Many people are perplexed that God should permit a situation in which human beings live in comprehension, in comprehension and bewilderment regarding his existence, while all the time God could save humanity from such a predicament. The problem of divine hiddenness refers to the epistemic situation, where we human beings live in a world in which God is transcendent, where we have limited cognitive faculties, and that nevertheless, knowledge of God is essential for our flourishing in this worldly and otherworldly life. And where in addition, it is supposed that God, the omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly loving one, has permitted us to live in bewilderment and perplexity regarding his attributes and existence.
Ebrahim, just if I interfere, could you please speak up a little bit? Thank you.
Okay. All the while,
Yeah, that's
knowing that,
okay,
knowing that it is essential for our well-being during our eternal life to believe in his existence, and thus to act according to his commandments. Based on this problem as laid out, one might expect that God would not permit such an epistemic situation to occur. Schellenberg's argument is famous for the non-existence of God based on the existence of non-resistant non-belief can be formalized as follows. One is premise one. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving. Premise two, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise three, non-resistant non-belief does occur. Thus, he concludes that no perfectly loving God exists, and so there is no God of Abrahamic religions. This argument has been widely discussed in the last decade. I have two concerns regarding the premise 2 and premise 3 of this argument as follows. My concern regarding premise 2. Premise 2 of this argument is false, since we can imagine some possible coherent scenarios according to which a perfectly loving God could have some outweighing reasons to justify his hiddenness to the extent that there would be possible to exist non-resistant non-believers. Consider the following possible scenario according to the teaching of Islamic mysticism. Kindly note that the scenario should not be a true one, but it only requires to be coherent or rational with theological teachings of Abrahamic religions. Coherent is that. Consider the hadith of the hidden treasure. According to this hadith, the purpose of the creation is knowledge of God. Quote, I was a hidden treasure, then I wanted to be known, then I created the creatures to come to know me. End of quote. This hadith corresponds with an important verse in the Quran, which clearly states that the human being is created for worshiping God. According to that hadith, God created creatures in order to be known. The metaphor of hidden treasure has largely been interpreted as referring to the aim of seeking and flourishing, such that humans become true worshippers and hence acquire knowledge of God. But acquiring that knowledge of God is not easy, and is not to be had on demand. It requires a lifetime's effort. Sufi texts are replete with clarifications of the steps towards perfection one must take in order to teach knowledge of God. But it should be stressed that only one who truly goes up the path of perfection and reaches the point where he or she devotes herself or himself completely to God really loves him. According to this scenario, God desires and expects human beings to recognize and to love him, to become his beloved, so that God will show them his secret, the jewels of the hidden treasure. Of course, God could have put us at the summit of the mountain from the first moment of our creation, as he does for angels. But the person who reaches the summit by meritorious endeavors is not the same as one who without effort settle at the point in the first moment. And our attempts to reach it are signs of our love of God and beauty. If we claim that we love God, we should show our desire to know him and be with him through the passion, dangers, and perhaps pain which accompanies our endeavors. The Quran asserts that God will test human beings regarding their claims about love and faith. Quote from the Quran, who has created death and life, that he may test you, which of you is best and dead. In Sufi tradition, which is certainly inspired by the Quranic themes, the notion of the test is crucial for love. God has invited us to undertake a difficult, long, and grueling journey toward the perfection that is to acquire knowledge of God and to become God's lover. But only real lovers can traverse this path and pass the test of love. According to this Sufi theme, divine hiddenness prepares a situation in which humans would be tested by the problems during seeking their way toward the love of God. Then God expects that we travel the path by states with hope and with fear. In each step, one will find the next moving wisely so that one can find his true way. Of course, this is a difficult road to stride, but the value to those who reach the hidden gemstone is to become a gem themselves. So divine hiddenness provides a situation for value creation. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief may occur, I think, since the entrance to the path of perfection and knowledge of God requires not only just non-resistance, but also some sort of enthusiasm, awakening, acceptance, will, hope, and decision to find the true path toward knowledge of God. Okay, my concern for the third premise of the argument.
2 minutes?
Okay. I have shown that it would be possible to exist non-resistant non-belief in a perfectly loving, if a perfectly loving God exists, but certainly the burden of proof is on the proponent of the argument to show that really there exists non-resistant non-belief in the actual world. So here I shall try to show the premise 3 of the argument also is hard to be defended. In other words, we have no good reason to accept that there is easily non-resistant non-belief. We can distinguish, following Aristotle, between 2 types of resistance. Resistance as incontinence, that one's desires and passions rule the will and turn it away from the right, and resistance as intemperate, in which one deliberately wills to act on a desire, despite one's belief that it would be bad to do the action. The proponent of the argument from divine hiddenness has to show that there could be a person who does not commit resistance in both mentioned conceptions, but still is non-believer. We can tentatively accept that if one heartfully asserts that she does not commit intemperance resistant, her claim is acceptable. However, we can always be soaked in self-deception on the free choice of the will. On the free choice of the will, Augustine says, sin is a kind of wrong attention, a defective movement in an incorrect direction that occurs self-deceptively. So still, it is hard to claim that one is innocently non-resistant, even she believes otherwise.
Time is up.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Ebrahim. Actually, Dr. Azadegan responded to the divine hiddenness argument by saying that maybe those who end up not believing in God may not have put enough effort, or maybe they are not enough enthusiastic. Otherwise, they might end up believing in God. And also, another point which was important is that the burden of proof is upon the shoulders of Aaron to show that those who end up not believing in God are enough truth seeker and not resistant. Okay, now it's time to Aaron to come up with a rejoinder. 5 minutes, please. You have to unmute yourself, Aaron. Sorry.
Start the timer now.
Yeah. Perfect.
All right. My screen's frozen, but as long as you can still hear me, I think we're good. All right.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Azadegan, for your opening comments. When I read them, I became impressed with your deep familiarity with the inner life of the human spirit and the importance of striving in trials and the path to maturity and spiritual growth. I agree with you that one can imagine situations in which God would choose to remain hidden so that a person would not have too easy of a time with the search for God and would not take knowing God for granted or as something to be expected, no matter what one's inner state is. Your vision, that is of course taken from Islamic sources, but also generalizes to the other traditions, of a person who spends a lifetime seeking God is a profound one. Yet I do not think extreme hiddenness, which results in complete unbelief and monotheism, typically promotes the good of seeking and finding. First, most people who seek God within a monotheistic tradition, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, do so because they already believe God exists, and what they want is to conform themselves to the divine character and image as much as is possible for a human to attain. Mere belief that God is real and is the good that we should all seek is an important motivator of the continued search for God as an increasingly present reality. Agnostics and atheists have a very hard time indeed being motivated to seek a being they either doubt is there or whom they positively believe is not real. I speak from experience here. When I was younger, I firmly believed in the existence of God and worshiped in the Christian tradition. When I have doubted the truth of theism, I've had a lot harder time maintaining the motivation to seek God through spiritual practice. Notice that a firm or even moderate belief in God, that God exists, merely helps motivate one to know God in a more interpersonal, experiential manner. It doesn't guarantee or even make it highly probable that one will seek God in a serious way. Hence, I do not think remaining hidden to the point at which a person doubts theism altogether typically serves to further the sort of spiritual journey that Dr. Azadegan recommends. I also do not think Dr. Azadegan's suggestions handle the two arguments I put forward in my opening statement. I have argued that God would be negligent remaining hidden from non-resistant non-believers if we face an afterlife judgment and the possibility of being cut off from God forever. The good of avoiding such a disastrous fate simply outweighs the spiritual goods that might or might not accrue to someone who has more freedom to seek God or not, because they do not believe in God to begin with. If we are playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-go-seek in which the fate of our very souls are at stake, then God is being rather unfair and even cruel by not alerting us to this fact. Furthermore, doctrines of afterlife judgment based on a failure to know and obey God are morally incoherent if the people being judged have no idea they should have been seeking God to begin with.
2 minutes.
Okay, so let me jump down. My second argument from hiddenness is also not well addressed by Dr. Azadegan's suggestions. Many well-intentioned people who are on the search for God are easily misled by people with charismatic personalities and who have an air of being educated and in the know about God to conduct their own spiritual practices in light of false teachings about God. This has had disastrous results. Finally, Dr. Azadegan's case against the very existence of non-resistant non-believers is implausible, given that we know that culture plays an enormous role in the beliefs that people form. Stephen Meitzen has pointed out that demographics are kind of the key to that. So he says, for example, Thailand has about 80 million people, 95% of which are non-theists. Saudi Arabia has about 26 million people, much of us are theists. There's no group level difference in character. You're going to get people of all sorts in both cultures. The main difference is one group is educated and raised in a Buddhist environment, the other in a monotheistic environment. So failure to seek is not a good explanation of why large number of people are not monotheists. And indeed, 3 billion people are not monotheists. And that's such an enormous group of people. Again, culture is going to play a far greater role in determining what they believe than some sort of internal heart condition that is itself shaped by culture and what we find. So what we find plausible and implausible is going to be highly affected by our interactions with other people. Most religious conversions occur early in life, not later when we have more knowledge. So yeah, I just don't think it's a view with much explanatory power to say that there
Time is up.
Aaron, do you want to just finalize your sentence? Because
Sure.
that was...
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, I just, so I think cultural forces at the group level have much more explanatory power than internal heart considerations, just given the demographics we see in theistic versus non-theistic cultures.
Okay, great. So now, so far we have heard the forced opening statements of Ebrahim and Aaron, and also Aaron's rejoinder. Now it's time to Ebrahim to come up with his response to Aaron's critical points. Ebrahim, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Dr. Rizzieri, for your comments. I have three rejoinders to three claims of Aaron. Claim one of him, divine hiddenness, I name it triple H argument, heaven, hell, and hiddenness argument. Divine hiddenness, he claims that, claim one, he claims that divine hiddenness is similar to endangering someone unnecessarily by withholding information, like the irresponsible doctor case. Okay, my response to this claim. The analogy fails, I think, since I think that divine hiddenness is not like the case of withholding information about God's existence without any outweighing or rational reason. We ought to distinguish between withholding information and veiling or hiding some facts in order to be unveiled or discovered by people who seek for the evidence through the right way. Why then the hide and seek game has to be played? Because this seeking is crucial in providing meaning for human life. Seeking for evidence of the great source of goodness gives value and meaning to the life of the seeker. Axiology of our life depends on our trying to find knowledge of God as infinite good. So it seems to me that divine hiddenness is not a case of unnecessarily withholding information, but it is the case of veiling information as invitation for coming up to the realm of value seeking. Dr. Rizzeri's second claim, his claims that complete lack of belief in God's existence undermines human beings' ability to choose freely to know and love God. This claim is about the degree of divine hiddenness, which is so deep that many people, while are open-hearted to believe, but because of the lack of evidence, could not even believe that God exists. And without that initial belief, how they can start the process of seeking for God as good. However, as I argued in the opening statement, God bestowed us a sense of divinity which is activated for every child in almost all human cultures that helps them to understand the sacredness of divinity underneath of the material world in instances of beauty, greatness, and kindness. It is not surprising that most of human population throughout the world believe in some sort of spirituality, and more than half of the world population are monotheists. It is noteworthy that sins affect our sense of divinity, but also our sense of morality. We should take the noetic effect of sin seriously, more seriously. So I agree that complete lack of any belief in the existence of sacred and supernatural divine word undermines our motivation to choose a path toward knowledge of God. But it is not so easy to claim that my heart is open to divine science and revelation, while at the same time ignoring that our wrong actions or beliefs can affect our desire to motivate us to seek for evidence of God. Dr. Rizzeri's third claim is that the freedom to make potentially harmful choices in a state of ignorance is not a good. So he concludes that the goodness of free will does not outweigh the evil of entering into hell as a possible consequence of one's ignorance of God's existence. In the same way, he also claims that a possible world in which no one could claim on behalf of God or could receive divine approval of her actions is a better than actual world where so many atrocities and oppressions have been allowed to be done in the name of God under his eyes. The theme of Both of his claims is the same. Rizzieri expects God to bound our freedom, not to act so right to the extent that the rightness of our actions can highly and harmfully defect our lives. The world he imagines is
Time is
populated.
up.
Okay.
Yeah, Ebrahim, do you want to just finalize your sentence, the last one?
I want to put the example of Harry Frankfurt's imaginary persons who has a chipset in their brain to do good actions. But in the next session, I will continue this.
Okay, great. Okay, so no, we have heard the opening statement as well as the rejoinders of both sides of the debate. It is time for what is called inter-panel discussion, or you can call it free debate. So debaters can now interfere during the other side's talk by, one might say, interrupting each other if it feels necessary. But of course, always the flow of the discussion should be maintained. But before getting into the inter-panel discussion, I have one question for each side of the debate. So Aaron, let me ask you a question about the nature of your version of divine hiddenness argument. Is it deductive or inductive? Are you, put it another way, are you saying that the very existence of non-resistant non-believers would undermine or disprove the very existence of God, or which is a deductive version, or are you saying that the amount of non-resistance non-believers, the huge maybe amount of non-resistance non-believers in your theory would undermine the likelihood of the existence of God, inductive version? And that's my question for you. And Ebrahim, if I may ask you also a question, because you said that maybe those who end up not believing in God are not enough motivated or enthusiastic truth seeker, or maybe not even truth seeker at all. And one objection might be raised against your argument, against divine hiddenness argument, that your position is presumptuous or self-righteous, to the effect that, okay, if you do not believe in God, you're maybe morally flawed. So what would be your response to that moral objection against your anti-divine hiddenness argument? So now the floor is open for 30 minutes inter-panel discussion. You can either begin with answering my question, or you can discuss it as you would like. Okay, I will not interfere. I prefer to just listen to you. Yeah, please.
You asked the questions. I think we could both take a minute and kind of respond to that, if that's acceptable. Yeah, I think my arguments, they're stated in a deductive form in the article I put out, but I indicate that the key premise of each argument is only probably true. So they're definitely inductive in spirit. Yeah, I don't think there is a valid deductive argument against, or a sound deductive argument against God's existence. I think our human cognitive limitations are real. There's always the possibility God has good reasons for doing things we're not aware of. I just don't think the suggested reasons quite get the job done. So I think there's a powerful objection on the table. But yeah, given human cognitive limits, I think there's always a possibility that, you know, something more profound is going on than we realize.
Okay, thank you. Ebrahim, you yourself, please.
Okay, my answer to your question is that the premise that there is non-resistant non-believers are not easy to be supported. I do not want to claim that every non-believer is sinner, or morally flawed. But my claim that is that the burden of proof is on Schellenberg or the proponent of the argument to show that non-resistant non-belief exists. It is not an easy premise to be proved because there are many problems, many complex situations of self-deception, or perhaps there are some sort of sins that affect other people. Perhaps you teach your children in school some sort of naturalistic teachings and veil their eyes to the sacred word. So it is on behalf of you that the children of that school are not believers. We should take, my point is that we should take the effect, the noetic effect of sin seriously, more seriously. Okay.
I have more points to make, but I just wanted to remain silent, and you two, you can go on, please.
Is it possible for me to continue my objection to Dr. Rizzieri?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The proponent of the existence of non-resistant non-belief may raise an objection to my argument by the claim that she may say that some non-beliefs are due to human sin, but also note that there are doubters who have agonized for long years over matters of faith and continue to Yaser's question, hoping that belief may come to them. They have tried to acquire faith and to remedy their disease caused by their sins. However, despite their endeavors, they honestly claim that they are empty-handed. My answer to this sort of objection is by alluding to the distinction between objective and subjective sin, and henceforth their defective consequences. Consider a lifeline seeker who has long agonized over matters of faith, but who took a wrong path. Perhaps this person is not blameworthy for any subjective sin, but her objective sin has consequences upon the person's recognition of the truth. As Azali teaches us, our sins can damage our God-gifted sensitivity to the extent that many of us do not believe in God's existence and cannot see his glorious existence, God's creatures, which are God's signs. In addition, we have the power to cure the depravity, which is the consequence of sins, by stopping sinning and undertaking repentance. But instead, we demand convincing evidence for belief in God while forgetting to remedy our heart, which in fact is failing to function properly, producing the proper belief in God. Our most important type of resistance is that our hearts love ourselves and do not tend sufficiently to love God and our neighbors. This self-centeredness, which seems to be the root of our resistance against goodness, makes our heart ill. Our heart requires remedy, and if we do not attend sufficiently to its remedy, we are definitely resisting God's guidance and graces. One result of this resistance is not non-belief in God, which is the consequence of the malfunction of sensitive states.
May jump in. So if we were to go with that line of thinking, kind of take it to its logical conclusion, then the idea would be the more humble person, the person who's at least more willing to kind of see themselves as in need of moral improvement, the person who maybe engages in more moral striving. So at the group level, you would expect such persons to be likely to become monotheists, because they would be the true seekers taking it seriously. They'd be the ones finding God. And then on the other hand, you would have people who have various vices, who are very selfish, that would populate the group of non-theists, but that just doesn't match our demographics. So again, if you're born in Thailand and you're a serious moral striver, you may very well end up being a very compassionate Buddhist who doesn't believe in monotheism. It's pretty common, people entered their adulthood kind of inheriting their religious beliefs quite a bit. And so as you enter adulthood, like for example, if you're going to a United States prison, you'd find a lot of people who believe in God. But you know, this is a population that has made their share of mistakes. And pretty much anywhere you find widespread monotheism, you just get all types. You get your profound saints and moral heroes. You get your average believer of average attention. You get Frederick Douglass's slave masters. You get people who seem to be seeking and seem to be exhibiting in some ways some sort of spirituality done in the name of theism or God, but their heart doesn't improve, you know. So I don't think the pattern you're describing has any empirical evidence. You know, I've been in churches where people left the faith maybe through moral struggle. I've also had good friends who left the faith because of moral growth. So they began to see, for example, the doctrine of hell itself as being unethical, because an infinite punishment for a finite amount of sins, punishment doesn't fit the crime. So by growing in their understanding of morality and what a morally perfect being would be like, you know, I've seen people leave various Christian traditions. I've seen very morally sensitive people experience tragedy and get their doubts about God that way. I've seen, people who are pretty much any way you can imagine that someone enters the faith or leaves the faith occurs all the time. And the common thread is not the quality of their character, or maybe even more complexly, the kind of humility to acknowledge certain things. There's humble people out there who are very downtrodden and very alienated from their religious instincts. You mentioned human sin might not only disrupt some sort of innate capacity to form beliefs about God innately. That's obviously Evelyn Flanagan in the Christian tradition has talked about this. But again, John Marsh has this really good paper on divine hiddenness where he says, actually, if you look at our innate belief forming mechanisms, they tend toward polytheism. We tend to project spirits, deities, gods, goddesses, nymphs, fairies, all over nature. And that monotheism is a bit of a latecomer in history. You see it in Judaism, you see it in Plato a bit. But that's actually going against the grain, you know, and there's a scripture in the Christian tradition from the book of Romans where Paul says something like, very early on in human history, it was worship of the created thing that replaced worship of the creator. So Paul's saying, people have become natural polytheists, not natural monotheists. So some sort of grace is necessary to get them out of that rut. So I think our innate belief forming capacities are not uniquely monotheistic. And I think, people enter and leave faith for all kinds of reasons. And that pattern that you're asserting is not detectable in experience. Like some people fit the pattern, but a lot of people don't.
But to understand my pattern, we should consider the importance of free will and its role in the scenario of divine hiddenness. I think in this eternal scenario for human beings, God is hidden in order that we come to His love freely and to find the true way toward Him freely. This is very important, and because, as for example, Michael Murray and other philosophers says about the importance of free will defense, not in the problem of evil, but in the problem of divine hiddenness. Because if there is much more evidence for God, then we observe to His beauty. Then we find His love without effort, without hesitation. So if he desired that we come to His love freely, the evidence for God's existence should be to some extent hidden, and this hiddenness also makes makes it possible for us to have faith in God, not just believe in God's existence, but believing God's existence is not at all important in religion, because for example, in the Quran we have texts that there are many people who believe that God exists, but it is not religiously important. What is important is that our heart believe in God or trust in God. That is the case of faith. So to become faithful in God, a faithful human being in God, we require some sort of hiddenness. Why? Because in the hidden situation, we have some fear, tremblance, some hope, and this sort of attitude become possible in the hidden situation. But if we are free, perhaps as you can freely help people in your, for example, area, to, for example, you can help poor people. It is possible for a human being to come as a missionary to other countries, to other areas, to guide other people, and to help them to find true way, and to help them to see the sacred word better. So it is upon us to go freely to some demographic sides of the earth. The people in Iran and in Saudi Arabia, or perhaps in England or America, tried in many years to help people to find true way, but for example, in some sort of the earth in Thailand, as you mentioned, we believers do not do our
Well, let me say a couple things in response. So the conclusion of my first argument is that it's not the case that a morally perfect God exists, and there's negative afterlife results for those who fail to know God. Now, let's say that one way out of the argument is to keep theism and just reject the negative afterlife results part. And a lot of more liberal versions of Christianity, for example, well, that's just kind of what they do. Like, people in that tradition become what are called universalists. So they hold the belief that eventually everybody comes into a proper relationship with God, maybe in the afterlife, or they hold a view where, like, Catholic Christians have this view called purgatory, where it's kind of like an intermediate state between heaven and hell. So as you enter the afterlife, you know, it's not all decided yet. There's still further opportunity to kind of zig or zag toward God or away. If the universe is like that, where there's some sort of prolonged engagement with the divine, even after death, and one's fate isn't solely determined based on your choices here and your beliefs here and the state of your heart here, then I actually find a lot of what you're saying in some grander scheme could be very plausible if the process continues after death. My concern, though, is that if you hold to a view of the afterlife where, okay, you die and you go face judgment, whatever you did, you did, because a lot of our choices were under conditions of ignorance, because we're so highly influenced by those around us, that playing field seems grossly unfair in order to make that kind of eternally significant decision. So I just think the world is poorly set up to have like a staggered revelation of who God is, commensurate with what the person would benefit given their inner state as they move through life. So in the Christian tradition, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Till We Have Faces. And this was his basic idea. The individual has to have a certain possession and maturity of the self before they're even ready to encounter the divine, or else they're just not, in a sense, solid enough to even connect with the divine in ways that would benefit their soul, would cause a growth process. And that seems plausible to me if the universe is not as it appears. Because in this life, people often experience tragedy when they're not ready. So the net effect is some sort of nihilism, not some sort of deeper spiritual movement in their soul where, like, okay, now I'm really questioning the meaning of life. Well, this one's kind of tragic. Maybe there's something beyond it. I'll seek that. I mean, that definitely happens, but you also get people who are utterly crushed by the pain they endure, and then they move away from God. So if the afterlife story is a lot more complicated than maybe a straightforward reading of certain holy texts would seem to say, then yeah, I think a lot of what you're saying is plausible. It's just like this sharp cutoff, heaven, hell, based on what you decided here under conditions of ignorance. I think that's what really gets me hung up about that sort of doctrine.
Okay, let me come back to your third claim that it was very important for me. The claim that a possible world in which no one could claim on behalf of God or could receive divine approval for her actions is a better than actual world, where so many atrocities and oppressions have been allowed to be done in the name of God under his eyes. And my concern is that you expect God to bound our freedom, not to act so wrong to the extent that the wrongness of our actions can highly and harmfully affect our lives. The world you imagine as populated with horrifying for imaginary persons who has a chip set in their brain to do good actions. If you choose to act according to the rules of God, for example, then you are free to act. But whenever you choose to act unlawful or wrong or morally wrong or not according to God's Sharia, for example, then the chipset will activate so that your brain commands you to refrain from doing unlawful action. Of course, in such a world that you imagine, there would be no atrocities in the name of God. And as the outcome, everybody will go to heaven after her death. But this
Well,
word is several goods that can be actualized in our work. That freedom to choose between wrong and right is limitless. Our work contains, for example, in our Shia doctrine, Imam Hussein, in our word, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, and many unknown people who devote their whole life to help their people to reach freedom and liberty against oppressive regimes. For example, regimes that work on the name atrocities or dictatorship or totalitarian regimes that are on the name of God, but they resist against these regimes. The goodness that these resistance could actualize in a word cannot be actualized in the word that you imagine.
Yes, I was picturing a world where people still have the freedom to choose good versus evil. They're just psychologically modeled in a way that when they choose evil, they don't do that in the name of God. That's, yeah, given the way in which a person's beliefs and convictions that are morally loaded interact with their behavior, maybe it's hard to say just because I can imagine the world it's actually possible. Maybe there's some deeper difficulties there that inspection would reveal. But the purpose of that thought experiment was just to kind of point out what a toxic mess we often have in this world. So we often have people who, all right, let's say they're kind of evilly motivated. So Douglas's slave master, and Douglas's slave master attends a revival meeting where, from his own first person perspective, he thinks the Holy Spirit has entered, give him some renewed spiritual passion. And then the net effect is that slaveholder goes back and now believes God is sanctioning cruelty. It's that sort of situation that I think is surprising, given a morally perfect being. You'd think God would at least set the world up.
But Douglas is free to act in the name of God. So,
right, I guess that's. But that makes the moral nature of God so cloudy that on the group level you end up undermining people's freedom to know God.
But
so take a medical.
Why do you think that the Douglas sin is on behalf of God? Because Douglas.
5 minutes.
Why do you think that the Douglas sin is on behalf of God?
So Douglas, why is the question? Why do I think Douglas's slave owner is sinning in the name of God?
Yeah,
because the way Douglas lays it out,
is a free person.
Okay, so take a medical context. You want people to have informed consent. In order to achieve informed consent, they have to have a clear knowledge of what the options are and what they're actually choosing. If you get people doing evil in the name of God, and that goes unchecked, and you get just this charismatic person spewing hatred, but that person easily convinces others they're speaking in the name of God, then they're actually undermining freedom to either follow God or not, because freedom requires some level of clear information. And that's why misleading information, being deceived, that's typically seen as a form of coercion that undermines freedom, as is complete ignorance of the consequences that are in play. So freedom is best preserved by having at least some level of knowledge of what it even means for there to be a morally good being who desires our allegiance. Once that gets cloudy, then I think the freedom people have to choose actually goes way down. So that's why I think free will theodicies are ineffective in relation to that second problem, because misinformation about God's character, nature, and will, a misinformation that can permeate an entire culture. For Douglas, that was the Southern United States before the Civil War in relation to slavery. It just undermined people's ability to latch on to the moral character of God in a way that would have caused them to actually be seeking God in a way that produced good results. So I don't think these free will theodicies, the problem isn't that I don't think free will is important. The problem is I think a precondition of free will is having reasonably accurate information about what you're choosing for and against. So in the Christian tradition, there's Judas Iscariot who follows Jesus around and ultimately betrays him. Well, yeah, it's easy to say if those stories were true, that Judas had a lot of freedom. Judas knew what was up. But a lot of other people, yeah, maybe they didn't. Maybe they thought some other movement, maybe more violent in nature, was the right way to go. And they're just fundamentally confused about that. And so, yeah, I think by increasing confusion about who God is, the degree of divine hiddenness in this world actually undermines people's ability to freely choose to follow God or not. But I agree, freedom's good. I just think it's undermined by divine hiddenness in a lot of cases.
Consider two price. One Douglas that is a slaveholder, and the other is I do not remember his name, but the friend of Nelson Mandela that
Tutu.
Tutu in South Africa to help his people to be free from apartheid. Consider both of them, okay? And or in the context of Christianity, consider the Jesus Christ and in the opposite of him, the Jew leaders in old Palestine, okay? But in both cases, we have some people that work in the name of God. One is a slaveholder, and the other is who devote his life for the liberty of his people. Okay, we can see both of them, but and God let people to do their activities according to His name, for example. But it is up to us to find the true way. It is we are free to go to the right way or to the wrong way.
30 minutes is up.
Yeah. So I don't think that it is on the shoulder of God to prevent Douglas, for example, or some totalitarian regimes in our neighbor, that to prevent them from doing some actions in the name, some atrocities, some oppressions in the name of God. They are free to do that, but we have reason to find that this is not in accordance to God's command.
Okay, so before going further, I just wanted to share a quick observation. It's not a question, just an observation, but you're free to address it in your closing statement. It seems to me that the one source of difference between Ebrahim and Aaron is axiological difference, in the sense that if one attaches very high value to free will, one might not be bothered so much by divine hiddenness because, you know, the free will comes at the price of maybe God's being a little bit far away, giving space to human being. While if one is so concerned with atrocities, with the evils, including taking God to be absent as an evil, then one might end up believing that it is worse to limit one's free will, but instead we have a world which is not full of atrocities. So that is a quick observation. So now it's time to hear the closing statement of Dr. Aaron Rizzieri for 5 minutes, please. Yeah.
All right, 5 minutes. All right, I'll just filibuster. Yeah. So I do think freedom of the will is a good under certain circumstances. So if you're, let's say you're diagnosed with an illness, you go to the doctor, you should have informed consent on what you choose. So you get the details about the illness you have, you get the details about the potential treatments, the effects those treatments would have on your body, their likeliness of success. The sort of freedom that gives a person agency to decide on the facts at hand is a freedom of high value. What's weird about Blaise Pascal's suggestion, Dr. Azadegan's suggestion, is that they're trying to argue, as far as I understand it, that freedom under conditions of ignorance is still valuable. But that I don't agree with. And so it's not like I don't think freedom of the will is important. I just don't think freedom to choose between a good and bad option under conditions of ignorance is itself a good situation to be in. So that's the sort of freedom you wouldn't want in relation to the divine. And again, going back to some of the demographics I mentioned, if you're born in Thailand and you're a religiously, spiritually serious person, you're probably going to end up a Buddhist. And that's a sample size of 80 million people. So the idea that large numbers of those people were free to choose theism instead is implausible. Because if a large group of people is free to choose an option, I'm assuming we're talking about some sort of libertarian conception of freedom, where your character and in your environment doesn't lock in a unique choice. It means there's a non-zero probability of choosing theism. If it's significant freedom, then it's going to shoot up to at least around 50%. But then it would follow of logical necessity that large numbers of Thai people would be monotheists. That's just given the nature of what freedom is. So the fact that virtually none of them are, the best explanation is they don't have the freedom to choose to be monotheists, given their upbringing, given their the spiritual options that were put on the table for them. So it's just okay. Yeah. So it's implausible that people in non-monotheistic cultures, by and large, even have the freedom to become monotheists. And again, once the knowledge of the choice is blurry enough, the choice itself loses all value. It would be better not to have to make a free choice under conditions of ignorance. Yeah, and then again, if the universe is such that it's theistic, but there's some sort of afterlife story we don't have access to, things continue to play out after death, there continues to be opportunities to know or not know God, then yeah, I'm actually not nearly as bothered by the problem of divine hiddenness. For me, the problem resides when you combine belief in theism with a belief that the choices we make in this life are really determinative of our eternity, that's where I kind of step off the train and think, okay, that's a morally perfect God wouldn't set things up that way. But I appreciate a lot of the insights. In relation to the problem of evil in general, there's something called the soul-making theodicy, where, yeah, difficulties can lead to virtues, and I think that's right. So the problem is, the response has always been, if you get the wrong difficulty at the wrong time, you're going to end up with a vice or some sort of loss of hope. And when you look around the world, it doesn't look like the adversity people suffer is being tailored really well to what they need to take a step in the right direction at that moment. So yeah, it happens a lot. You get tremendous acts of bravery and courage and fighting against oppression. But you also get people convinced by the regime. You get
time is up.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll just let it rest there. Yeah, good.
Thank you very much. Now let us hear the 5 minutes closing statements of Dr. Ebrahim Azadegan, please.
Okay. Look at the Schellenberg's argument again. He starts his argument by divine love and expect that the loving God should create a world in which every normal human being who open her heart for believe in God can be in relationship, in love relationship with God. This is the expectation that John Schellenberg has from the God worldly, the word that created by loving God. But when we look at the conception of love, first of all, we can distinct between two sorts of love, two conceptions of love: the agape and eros. The agape is a sort of love that is for all human beings and of all creatures, without any expectation for the relationship. But as John Schellenberg says, and I agree with him, divine love requires some sort of relationship, because in relationship, human beings come to flourishment, come to better life, and come to have some view about the other world, the sacred world, and so on. So his expectation is admirable, and I agree with him. But when we take attention to the conception of love, this conception requires the other side, the human side, to freely choose this relationship. Without freedom, there is no love relationship. We cannot coerce people to come to love. So this sort of freedom to choose our path toward God's love requires some sort of hiddenness, and also some sort of revelation. This is the world that we now live in. I think that there is some revelation of God in beautiful sights, for example, in flowers, in virtue person also, we can see the face of God and his evidence and his signs in moral persons.
2 minutes.
And so by this is the revelation of God also in the sacred text, and also in good people, in the beautiful side. So there is some sort of combination of revelation and hiddenness in our work. The revelation makes us observed to divine beauty, and the hiddenness provides the level that we can freely choose our way. This is the view that I have about the problem of divine hiddenness in our world, because if we look at this world that God creates, it is really perplexing word, and the conception of God is also perplexing and complicated. He acts in our world. He listens to our prayers. He accepts our prayers. He even listened to a debate between, according to the Quran, between one man and woman in their house. But also he is transcendent from our world. So this sort of transcendence and immanent that is the nature of Abrahamic God makes the problem of the divine hiddenness so problematic and so difficult to be solved.
Time is up.
Thank you. Thank you, Ebrahim. Okay, so we have reached question and part section. So if you have any question, please write it down in the chat box. So the first question, I would like to ask if the problem of the divine hiddenness comes because we focus on specific monotheistic religions' classical view of God. If we do not confine the divine within the monotheistic interpretation, then it becomes hard to argue that the divine is hidden. The divine, in this broad sense, is manifested all around us, and it is reasonable to expect that the manifestation would lead one to the acknowledgement that we, as individuals and as humans, are not the center of the universe, that there exists a force beyond us, and that we should behave accordingly, morally. And okay, actually, that question addressed a part of the question that I was having. I just wanted to ask Aaron, because it is not specified, but the question is clearly addressed to Aaron. And Aaron, how do you explain divine revelation in the form of prophethood or incarnation? Because, you know, if God is divine, that might be a problem for deistic God, a kind of God that does not and has not manifested himself or herself. But theistic God is a kind of God which is supposedly has manifested himself or herself. And what about if someone is pluralist, in the sense that even non-monotheistic religions has a kind of divine manifestation, maybe not in a personal kind of deity manifestation, but in a non-personal kind of manifestation? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I think it's important to, I think you have to specify a view of God one is interacting with. I don't think what Christians have this concept of general revelation of God through nature. The problem is it latches on to something in us that's very non-specific. So if you look at Greek thought, for example, when Plato wrote the Republic, the deities, I wouldn't say they worship them, they just largely bribe them through sacrifice. Zeus and Hera and Ares and Aphrodite, you know, they were all personifications of human nature. At least that's what like a later Freudian might say about them. And they were immoral. They were petty, they were cruel, they were easily bribed by sacrifice to join any cause, including raping, pillaging, invading. And the Republic is Plato, through the mouthpiece of Socrates, saying, wait a minute, our Greek theology is immoral. So by separating out to a degree the concept of virtue and moral goodness from religious concepts, Socrates and Plato began to critique Greek thought to get a more humane religion. Sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. There's a lot of religions throughout the world that have very little to do with morality, even if they have a lot to do with, say, appreciations of various natural objects, right? So animism, for example, it's profound in its own way, but it's not serving a distinctly moral function. I'm not an expert in world religions, but polytheism largely lost to monotheism in a lot of parts of the world precisely because it didn't have a coherent moral center. So I don't think the religious impulses of humanity are by their very nature ethical. I think that is an evolution that often occurs within a religious tradition, and it's good when it does, but I don't think that there is an obvious fact of the matter, even if you define God broadly, that there's a deep connection between what we'd consider humane, compassionate behavior and the will of God. There's just so many traditions out there that are either amoral, they're just not really engaging the moral instinct, or maybe even positively immoral. So that would be my thought.
Mm-hmm. Ebrahim, do you have anything to add?
I want to have two brief points. One, we should distinguish between the problem of divine hiddenness from the argument from divine hiddenness. The problem of divine hiddenness is, to some extent, about the situation of human being in the world and its relationship with divine world, whereas the divine is in monotheistic tradition or in other traditions, there is some problem about, because we have limited cognitive faculties, we live in a natural world, and if there is another supernatural world, the relation between us and that world is the problematic. This is the problem of the source of the problem of divine hiddenness. But the argument from this problem that Schellenberg presented is about the monotheism, is dedicated to monotheism, at the claim that the God of Abrahamic religion is benevolent and is loving, and the expectation from that God is that there would be no resistant unbelief. Yeah, this is my point.
Okay, great. Okay, the second question is, I would like to have the definition of the God by everyone to get their concept better. So I suppose this question is posed to both of you. Yeah, Aaron, do you want to go first, please?
I think we'll more or less agree on this one. So if we're dealing with the monotheistic deity, that's typically been defined as a being separate from the creation, who's all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect, and all-loving. So yeah, and there's just one of such a being, hence the mono in theism. So yeah, I think that's the concept we're working with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ebrahim, you too, please.
Well, we normally define God by his perfection, and but he is the greatest possible being, and I myself admire that perfect being theology. So I can define God by his goodness, with capital G. Yeah.
Okay, still, if you have any question, please write it down in the chat box. Meanwhile, let me ask another question of mine. You know, Aaron and Ebrahim, I am personally perplexed by the relationship between the problem of evil and the hiddenness problem. So I just wanted to see, how do you recognize, how do you characterize the relationship between the two? Do you, for example, take the problem of hiddenness as a sub-branch of problem of evil, or maybe other way around, or you take them to be two separately related, but at the end, separate questions and problems. And if you take them to be separate, which one is more fundamental? Yeah, Aaron, you first, please.
Yeah, I think it to be a subspecies. So I think the moral problems associated with God remaining hidden, anytime you're offering a moral criticism of the deity, you're raising a version of the problem of evil. But I also think it intensifies other subspecies of the problem. So for example, one reasonable expectation we have of loving persons is, even if there's good reasons not to intervene and solve it or resolve some sort of evil, a kind of encouragement, a kind of presence, a kind of calming, that in itself is very, very helpful. Now, a lot of religious believers will tell you they experience that on a regular basis. They'll enter a time of prayer, meditation, and they will sense what they consider to be the divine presence. I guess my concern would be a lot of people don't experience that, either because, I don't know, they haven't been trained in such techniques, or don't have the right role models to follow, or that they engage in that sort of thing and they still have just a non-response, or an apparent non-response from the divine. So I think that intensifies, okay, not only am I intensely suffering, and a lot of people experience that, but then they feel abandoned in that suffering. So I think it kind of intensifies even other subspecies of the problem of evil.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Ebrahim, you please.
Formally, both of the argument are the same. Both are based on some sort of expectation from God. In the evil problem, we expect that the amount of evil be lesser than we experience, and in this in the hiddenness problem, we expect God not to be hidden. It is famous that when Wagen argues that these two problems are separate, because he imagined a world, for example, a good society without any pain, without any problem, that people live there, but there is the problem of divine hiddenness for them. They have no evil, they have no pain, but they can sense the problem of divine hiddenness, because many people over there are not believers in God. I think that the problem of evil is a subsidiary of the problem of divine hiddenness. Because when you experience evil, for example, consider the people in Auschwitz, or in prisons under oppressive regimes. Their pain is very hard to be tolerated, because they think that God is silent, because God does not come to help them. For example, you can see the Deus abscondidus in the case of Jesus Christ. Oh, my Lord, why do not answer me? This, when we are in pain, if we have some sort of sympathy, some sort of listening to our voices, some sort of listening to our prayers, If we do not face with divine silence, then that pain can be tolerable. So if we face this divine help, that sort of pain is tolerable. So the main the essence of the problem of evil that makes it so difficult is that we do not sense God's help in our pains.
Yeah. 1 minute. 1 minute to the question and answer session.
Thank you. So interestingly, we have got two different responses to the question regarding the relationship between the problem of evil and problem of hiddenness. Aaron saying that the problem of hiddenness is an instance of the problem of evil, while Ebrahim saying other way around, that the problem of evil is an instance of problem of hiddenness. So maybe a very quick final question. I remember that in our preparatory session that we had maybe a month ago with Aaron, Ebrahim, and our colleagues, that idea was raised that maybe it is impossible metaphysically for God to not to be hidden, because it's like a sun, as mystics would say, it's like a sun, that in order to be able for us to live under the sun, it should be very far away, otherwise we end up being burned. So what, very quickly, maybe a couple of seconds, what is your reactions, Aaron, Ebrahim, to this, I think, very interesting metaphysical response to divine hiddenness arguments? Aaron, you first, please.
Yeah, I mean, clearly an infinite being cannot be fully experienced by a finite one. So there's a logical impossibility of getting literally a complete revelation of God and experience. But there's also a clear sense of, if someone doesn't even believe and even have a concept of the monotheistic conception, that there's a higher degree of hiddenness. But I agree, like complete contact with God would be metaphysically impossible.
Ebrahim, you please.
The source of this idea is, I think, in Ibn Arabi or other Islamic mystics. They see God as totally hidden, and as God as known, God as totally hidden. And so every presentation of him, every revelation of him makes him manifested, but at the same time, his manifestation is a veil of him. In our world that we live in, natural world, God manifested totally and completely for us to become the knower of him, but he is in the most hidden type of his existence. So the manifestation and hiddenness is two sides of his sort of revelation for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have reached the end of question and answer part, but before ending this session, I would like to express our sadness for the untimely death of one of our dear colleagues, Sayyid Abul Hassan Mukhtabad, 11th of January 1970 till the 22nd of January 2023. Our heart is heavy for this loss. Mr. Mukhtabad, a musician and journalist, was very interested in philosophical and theological discussions. And also Sajjawat Tabatabai, who was a philosopher and also a historian of Iran. Mr. Mukhtabad was very interested, as I said, in philosophical and theological discussions, and he would always help us in the media part of our ICCNC quarterly debate. May God bless Mr. Mukhtabad. We'll remember him in our prayers. So on behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center of the Northern California, I would like to thank Dr. Aaron Rizzieri and Dr. Ebrahim Azadegan for the very interesting debate. And also I would like to thank the people in the audience, wherever you are. If you're interested in this kind of debates, please stay tuned. Each session will, inshallah, will have one such debate. It is always free and no registration is needed. Thank you very much and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Harun.
As
And
Farsi. Khuda Hafiz. Thank you very much.
Both of you.
Cheers.